The session is about to begin.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to you to this monthly online session of the Hyderabad Literary Festival. Every Friday, Friday of every month, we have this session where we invite authors to talk about their books. And today we have two guests, Pankaj Seksaria and Naveen Tayil, who will be speaking to us about their very interesting book. This book, The First Steps, Citizen Science and Ecology in India, is based on a research conducted over a year and a half. First Steps is the first account of its kind that documents, maps, and analyzes the rapidly growing field of citizen science and ecology in India. It presents important elements of what has happened in recent years through a study of 17 such projects and sets the stage for what might be expected in the years to come. Our guest today, Pankaj Seksaria, is an associate professor, Center for Technology Alternatives for Rural Areas, or CITARA, and associate faculty, Center for Policy Studies, CPS, IIT Bombay. His research interests lie at the intersection of technology, society, science, and the environment. He is a doctorate in Science and Technology Studies, STS, from the Maastricht University, the Netherlands, where he worked on the cultures of innovation in nanoscience and technology research in India. He is also a member of the environmental action group Kalpavriksh and author of The Last Wave 2014, Islands in the Flux, The Andaman and Nicobar Story 2017 and 2019, and most recently, Instrumental Lives, an intimate biography of an Indian laboratory in 2019. Naveen Tayil is Associate Professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Delhi. His research interests lie at the intersection of law and STS, science and technology studies in three fields: legal and political theory, environmental law, and technology regulation. Prior to joining the department, he taught at the National Law School of India, Bangalore. He holds a PhD from the Tilburg Institute of Law, Technology and Society at the University of Tilburg, the Netherlands. His recent publications include Science and Social Movements, Oxford Biographies, Political Science 2018, Constructing Global Data, Automated Techniques in Ecological Monitoring, Precaution and Rectification of Risk, Journal of Big Data and Society 2018, and Visions for India Public Participation, Debate and the S&T Community, Current Science 2017, which is co-authored with Pankaj Seksaria. Talking to them is G.V. Ramanjaneyulu, who's an agricultural scientist with a specialization in agroecology, organic, natural farming, agribusiness management, and public policy. He designs community-managed extensions, enterprises, and programs, and pioneers innovations in organic, natural farming practices and institutional systems. He holds a PhD in agriculture from Indian Agricultural Research Institute. He is currently the Executive Director, Center for Sustainable Agriculture, and has in the past worked with the Indian Revenue Service, IRS, and the Indian Agricultural Research Service. Now, before we start the discussion, I would request both Pankaj and Naveen to please hold up the book. And if Ramu has the book also, please hold up the book to show our audience. You'll have to, yes, that's better, yeah. First Steps, Citizen Science and Ecology. This is the book. And it has very interesting.
I can't get it in focus.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know, for some reason, yeah. Now it is there. Now it's in focus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this contains a lot of interesting, capturing of cases and a lot of discussion of what goes into citizen science and ecology in India. Before I hand over the session to Ramanjanelu, I'd like to just inform about our next session, which is on December 2nd at 7 p.m. again. It is on podcasts, the latest thing in in social media, and a lot of people are hooked onto this podcast. It is called the Slightly Forced Podcast. We have Gail Pirkis and Hazelwood in conversation with our team member Usha Raman. So that is for December 2nd. Don't forget to tune in on that day. Now I would like to request Dr. Ramanjanelu to take the conversation forward with Pankaj Seksaria and Naveen Tayal. Over to you, Ramu.
Thanks, you, Kendra. Good evening, and Pankaj and Naveen. It's a great work. Good to see you in person and a couple of things. I had been associated with the people science movement and then trying to look at innovations happening beyond institutions in a world where institutional science is becoming the norm, and then now when people innovate, practicing people innovate, and taking that, how we can take it to people is one area I had a lot of interest. Second area I also had interest is about the environment, ecology, how to make people understand holistically into ecology. So these two areas were very close to my heart. In the last 20 years working in this space, I've seen a lot of difficulties in terms of taking this forward, telling people that this is very important to understand people's innovations or innovations happening beyond the institutions, and actually building up the people science. So that's something which I was always trying to try out. And your book really brings out interesting stories across, and how do you went about and then what was the reaction of the people when you first brought out your initial report, and then what made you to look into these things? And then you probably should narrate your journey, then why you got into this, and then what you have seen.
Sure. So let me take a first kind of shot at Ramu's question. So Ramu, I think we can come to the journey about Naveen and me, but I just like to point something very interesting in what you said. You spoke of people science and community science, and I think there is an interesting departure, if I might put it that way, when we talk of citizen science. Now, I think these are not still very sorted out, but it's actually very interesting how the term citizen science itself comes about. And the question of whether citizen science is just a change in nomenclature for what is generally understood as a community science or people science, or whether there is something new to it, or whether there is something different to it. And also, what do we, at a slightly more academic level, at a more critical level of questioning, what do we mean by people science, or what do we mean by community science? And certainly, what do we mean by citizen science? So the questions, interestingly, can be asked, and I think we try to do that a little bit in this work, is question of what do we mean by science on the one hand? What do we mean by the citizen on the other? And what happens when the two come together? And the question of whether it, like I said, is it different from community science? So for that, we also need to have a clearer and a sharper understanding of what we mean by community or public science, and whether they kind of overlap or they are just alternative names for the other. So if we look at the nomenclature, and I think many of us would agree that language, definitions, use of certain terms matter. How they matter, what is the context, I'm not too sure. But if you look at the history of citizen science as it is, not even as it is defined, but as it starts to come into use as a term, it's not a very new coinage of that particular phenomenon. Community science, public science, I think has a much longer history. How we understand it remains different, but what we call or what we have called public science and community science exists for much longer. So if you look at the history of citizen science, and we look at some of that literature in our book, it does not go back to more than 15 or 20 years. So the coinage itself comes out of a particular, I think, moment in history. And that needs to be perhaps understood and kind of problematized, if I might put it that way. Because in some senses, whether citizen science represents at a moment, at a juncture in history, the atomization, not the automization, but the atomization of the individual as against the larger community and the larger collective in doing a certain process of gathering knowledge and stuff like that. So I'll just park that here, and maybe Naveen can add to it, and we can come back to that. But just quickly, a couple of points on the journey of the book itself, and I also request Naveen to add to it, is that in 2016, when I finished my PhD in STS and I started to look for work to do, I was very keen on bringing together my old interest, and I'm talking of my personal interest in ecology, wildlife, birding, which I've done for a very long time, and this new journey that I had undertaken in STS, which is Science and Technology Studies, where in case there are somebody in the audience, just a quick snapshot is using methods and techniques and tools in sociology, history, anthropology to study the community of science and technology. So we kind of invert the lens and we study science and technology. So I was interested in bringing these two things together. So my interest in wildlife and ecology and my new journey in STS. And at that point, I thought this citizen science and ecology was appeared to be at a very interesting juncture. And at least for me, it seemed like it could bring the two together. I could continue to look at ecological dimensions, but also start to look at the people who are doing the citizen science, whether it is the citizen scientist, however we define the citizen scientist, the project coordinators who do citizen science projects. So what we concentrated in our book are on the coordinators, not on the citizen scientists in quotes per se. And at that time, there was an opportunity at IIT Delhi where Naveen is faculty. So I joined there as a senior project scientist, and we spent about 2 years, the two of us, trying to unpack this unfolding and newly emerging field of research, as it were. And we did a kind of literature review, a primary survey of about 17 citizen science projects, and we did a bunch of interviews with citizen science project coordinators, where we went into a bit of a qualitative analysis of what does citizen science mean to them? Why did they start this project? What does citizen mean to them? What are the challenges that they face in doing citizen science and going forward? So the book is, like you mentioned, we had a report on this, and the book is a kind of culmination of that inquiry, partially a historical literature review, some quantitative assessments of what the citizen science projects are doing, and then the more qualitative dimension of some of the perspectives on that kind of thing. So I'll stop there, and maybe Naveen can add and also bring in his journey into the whole thing. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Pankaj. Hello, everyone. Hi, Ramu. So just to take on from where Pankaj stopped, personal journeys apart, I think we came in, me and Pankaj came into it from different but complementary vantage points. In a sense that I was trained as a lawyer, and then I was more interested in regulation to start with, environmental regulation. But increasingly, I got more and more interested in knowledge making, and science being one of the important modern institutions of knowledge making. It naturally our attention went into it in particular vantage points in terms of just as Ramajani was mentioning earlier, people science movements I mean, if you look at scientific change, the question in science studies or philosophy of science always revolves around, so when you want to understand society, you look at social change. Similarly, if you need to understand science, the first attention usually would be on scientific change. So what is the locus of scientific change institutionally? And usually we talk about the locus being within scientific establishments. That's the conventional understanding of through the idea of scientific method, the practice of scientific method, where you incrementally change science through, observation. You hear about the scientific method as one indivisible, one kind of way of doing this. But increasingly, when we started looking at it, we could see multiple ways in which scientific change was happening outside of what we consider as the establishment. And social movements, other non-scientific platforms become so important, even in the literature and in practice. You could see that clearly. And if you think about it, you at one level you have radical scientists of various kinds who work outside of traditional establishments, right? And then you have we have a rich history of people science movements in our country and elsewhere in the world, where folks from outside the establishment really push through particular scientific methods and also through particular democratic political agendas to push the establishment towards a particular kind of scientific change and research and so on. And then this too seems to be almost like ideal types. And when you look more carefully, you would see other kinds of collaboration in between, where the platforms are far more mixed, So we were intrigued by the talk about citizen science. And as Pankaj mentioned earlier, where are we going away from the talk about people's science movement? Because by the 90s, I mean, you could also see a certain certain difference in the way people's science movements are being talked about and also being received. And one could intuitively connect it to a neoliberal turn within Indian society and polity and so on. But we were very curious how to understand this in the contemporary. That's really was the motivation at one level. At the second level, which we can talk about later, how is it that this kind of large-scale collection of data, large-scale data associations, how does that come about? What does that do to the polity, to knowledge making, and also to citizenship itself? Yeah, so this is the broad sort of inspirations we had to sort of start looking at this. Yeah, thank you.
That's interesting. I was associated largely with the people science movement, so it's a similar question I also always had. And the way people science movement began in this country and probably they got diluted also shows that they also became institutionalized. They also they became like establishment themselves. And then you know what the fallout of that front. So coming back to your own this report and then this study, can you also elaborate more on how you look at it when institutions partner with citizens and then generate knowledge, and how this methodology seems to be more inclusive, more participatory to get the knowledge, which otherwise people cannot otherwise it is not possible for the institutions. And then how and what is the scope of this methodology in terms of taking it forward in terms to other areas? So from this. So looking from the methodology, I'm not asking about the projects, what is the outcomes of the project, but this methodology. So basically, this is making citizens as part of the inquiry, and then getting data out of that, and then drawing conclusions from that. So making it more inclusive, because we have seen several such projects on various fronts on environment. I would say in the areas where mainstream institutions are not taking much interest, actually, we have seen rapid progress where people's participation was increasing. So from your point of view, so how do you see this? And then can you elaborate on that front?
So should I take that, Naveen?
Yeah.
So Ramu, three things I'd just like to flag. One is what we also did in the project ourselves methodologically is to identify projects that have self-identified as citizen science. So there might be a project which kind of broadly follows so-called similar methods, but we didn't kind of include it. And we also realized that we were not 100% comprehensive in terms of including all projects that were even calling themselves citizen science. So there is that methodological challenge that might be there. So whether people science and community science, citizen science remains an open question. And if we look at some of the ways it goes about doing it, it could well be called citizen science. So that's one just kind of clarification. Second point I just want to make again is, what we see very interestingly in these projects that we looked at and we make a comment in our book is also the locus of all these projects are still institutional. They are either NGO institutional or they are government scientific bodies institutional. So the NGOs or the institutions that are doing the scientific research, here we are talking only ecology, it is the same set of institutions that are kind of changing or adopting a new methodology. And what is very clear is that particularly where ecological studies are concerned and certain other domains of knowledge are concerned, the temporal and spatial scales that you need to cover, this seems to be a very apt method where you can cover large areas, geographical areas, which for a huge amount of optimized kind of resource use. The cost, travel, etc. can be deeply optimized. So that is very clear. Right? To go back to your point, you can see a lot of interesting information, analysis, data beginning to emerge. But where the question of method is concerned, and that's what we are trying to understand ourselves and problematize it in that sense, is what is the central tenet of a citizen science project? How does it happen? And if you look at the literature and if you talk to people, without really going into great detail, the first reaction and response for most people is of a voluntary contribution of data by citizens. So voluntarity is almost like the de facto response of the method of the whole thing. But when you start to scratch the surface, we see that there's a lot of complexity in the idea of voluntarity. So what is voluntary and how do you ensure voluntarity, I think is very important. So you may not pay somebody a stipend to gather data, but if you provide, and this is a question I've had and we try to ask, we don't go into great details, but if you provide me some incentive, including a name on the website or even authorship on a paper, I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with it, but what happens to the idea of them being a voluntary contribution? Does it still remain voluntary in the sense of contributing in the larger public interest without any self return in stuff? So to me, it's still not very clear. Broadly, one can say it's clear, but there are these kind of intersecting, interesting challenges. And the other point there is who owns the data and what happens to that data kind of stuff. So this question of what is the method and what is the larger implication, I think is a very open one still, because I don't think it's been settled in that sense. And the third point I'd like to make here is that there are two kinds of things that seem to be happening. One is going in line with the voluntary contribution, the idea that in some ways it's an activity of leisure. So somebody going out bird watching on a Sunday morning has a lot of time, is doing it for leisure and fun, and at the same time is contributing data. So there is a certain assumption or a certain normative position that you don't have a vested interest in the resource that you're looking at. So the question that some of the other projects are asking, and very interesting questions, is what happens when you are interested in the resource because your resource is a survival tool and you're also contributing data. So somebody sitting as doing a leisure activity contributing data has no stake in the resource per se. And somebody like, say, a fisherman fishing in the waters of Lakshadweep, going out on a fishing expedition and at the same time contributing data along with a scientific institution. Are these two the same kinds of citizen science? Because the points of entry are very different. The purposes are very different, and the social class, etc., is also very different. So you find very interesting. Now the fisher example that I give is more in the minority, but it opens up the question that you're asking. Why just I'm going into the detail. I don't think that question, to me at least, is certainly very clear of what is the method and what is the output of that in a methodological kind of sense. Of course, the results that are coming from citizen science projects are absolutely amazing. The insights, scientific insights, and stuff like that, plus conservation awareness, activism, etc., etc. But when the method is concerned, for me, it still remains a very interesting open-ended question as to what is the method that is involved. So whether gathering and contributing data or analyzing data. And within the literature, and I'll finish here, there are very interesting typologies, certainly coming from a Western context, of types of citizen science. So there's a data contributing citizen science, there is a data analysis citizen science, there is a education related citizen science, etc., etc. So even within the citizen science discussion, there are these categories. So yeah, maybe Naveen would like to also just have spoken a little too long, I think. Yeah.
No, you haven't. Thanks, Pankaj. Yeah, that's very useful. So I can
That's very useful. Yeah.
I can take off from where Pankaj stopped. So the cue is about from methodologies of the study, Ramu, to the methodologies of science itself, and where do you place these kinds of interventions and endeavors? Yes, I think so. In that sense, when Pankaj stops with saying, "Are they data collectors? Who are these people? What are they doing within a scientific endeavor?" I mean, if you're talking about these citizen scientists as data collectors, there is, in some ways, we have a 300, 400-year-old history. Even someone like Darwin. I mean, Darwin really didn't move out of his little shire in England. No, I'm now being irrelevant, of course. But he had a huge network of collectors who used to collect it across the world. And he used to sit in some ways, in his own, in the times that he was in, he was analyzing it. So in that sense, we had data collectors who were not scientists, who were paid in some ways. Here, Pankaj would suggest in that sense that as long as you're not paid, you become a citizen scientist. So what are these endeavors then? Are we talking about voluntary endeavors of just data collection? Because that becomes very important in the sense that it's the need of the scientific establishment currently because of scale. I mean, it's just pure scale, scale, and scale, right? You have, if you look at biodiversity knowledge making, general ecological knowledge making, currently, you have to really look at temporal scale and spatial scale. If you look at any sort of change of habitat, species, populations, any sort of fundamental data on ecological health, you would end up having to look at the difficult question of temporal and spatial scale. And it's simply impossible for any mainstream, however funded you are, to be able to handle that kind of scale within the scientific establishment. So in some ways, it is really the need of the hour for the scientific establishment to be able to tap into, in some ways, an excess energy, excess some kind of initiative which a small sliver of the population is really engaging with. But can we move beyond that in our imagination of citizen science? But then becomes a challenge for us, because we also think about citizen science or people science movements as an imagination of democratization of science, which necessitates us to think about these endeavors as not mere data collectors. But what more can they be then becomes a challenge. Can they end up being drivers and framers of research questions, hypothesis, testing hypothesis? There are some examples, prominent examples from India, Frogwatch and so on, where citizen scientists also become part of authorship in prominent journals. But these are very rare by itself. And many mainstream scientific platforms within mainstream conventional scientific institutions would not recognize that kind of a role for citizen science endeavor. That here is the challenge, to think about then how do we understand these kinds of endeavors. So I must stop there for now. But we must come back to what Pankaj was talking about earlier in terms of ownership, roles of recognitions and so on. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So for me, whether it is voluntary or if the costs are covered is not an issue. And I'm also not looking at the data generated as a hobby kind of thing when you're talking about leisure, that kind of thing. But certainly institutions involving people who are outside institutions, and then developing a methodology where that is taken and accepted by the institutions. I think that is something which is very interesting, because mostly the people science movements became more of a anti-establishment kind of thing, I would say, in their endeavor, and then also largely influenced by the political thinking of their promoters, I would say. They're like all either the PPST or the AIPS and became like that. So from that point, this looks interesting, how the acceptance in the institutions have come up, and the people's participation in the methodology, and then and also how it went about, whether the building the skills in terms of not only data gathering but also about analysis and then interpretations, because when you're involving people who are at the grassroots, who are actually doing it, probably interpretations also may be done much better than the institutions, because many times institutions get caught up in their own frameworks. So could you see any such incidents in these?
So I must also make one thing, just a little clarification also. What we are presenting in the book is a kind of representation of what the scientists and the project coordinators are saying. So it's more like a reporting and an analysis, as an analyst and not as an actor. So we of course have our positions, and so when we say democratization of science, of course a lot of the project coordinators also believe in that process. So that's very interesting in that sense of what the institutional kind of thing is. But so I just want to make, it's not like we're trying to be a little detached from our particular positions when we make the book. We are not taking a position on that to the extent we perhaps might take in a different discussion. So I also want to make a little bit clear. So I'm also looking at it more as an analyst and not as much as a say detaching it in some senses from my own politics to begin with. Having said that, what you said, Ramu, I think is very interesting, and I feel one of the things that the citizen science is doing, maybe not explicitly, is the depoliticization of the knowledge creation process.
Correct.
So these are mainstream scientific institutions within which there are individuals who are very committed to the idea of knowledge and also committed to the idea of democratization of knowledge. But in the way the people science movements were political or had ideologies.
Correct.
And that is, I think, where the citizen in some senses, perhaps what Naveen referred to earlier as the neoliberal turn, as it were. So I don't even know if we can still say that, but that's an interesting question to ask, because it is the citizen as a unit not coming together in a collective. These are all disparate entities located geographically in very different spaces. And what actually brings them together is technology. So they're not physically, socially coming together in the conventional sense. So one of the key things that we see in the current turn in citizen science, in the way that we discuss in the book and in the way people are identifying as citizen scientists, and all of them admit to it, are a certain family of contemporary technologies, which includes the internet, which includes mapping, which includes apps, which include that kind of communication technology. So this kind of project method, like the example that Naveen gave, has happened in the past, but has happened at a very different kind of paradigm, certainly of speed, of scale. And we, again, in the book and otherwise, there's a lot of literature available where contribution of data has led to very interesting insights, but it was never called citizen science per se. And what has actually mobilized it is this whole set of technologies. So where does the politics come in? I think is a very interesting question. And how will it come in? Should it come in? How do the project coordinators look at that? I think it's still something that needs to be understood from, as an analyst, from that kind of view. So it is in some sense, it's just saying, just give us good quality data. Of course, there's some analysis, and there are other ways that people are looking at the citizen science. And I think there's a question in the chat box, and we can look at that later. We discussed that, but that's where some people are trying to politicize that whole thing also, and not politicize as in politicize, but make it political, because it's about knowledge and not about apolitical data, and what is the knowledge for. That I think becomes very, very important. So when you say that the people science movement became anti-establishment, can citizen science become anti-establishment? And what would it mean in the current frame for that to be? And will it be allowed? Et cetera, et cetera. I think are very open and very interesting questions at this point. It's early in the Indian context, but I think those are very interesting questions that we'll have to kind of look forward to. Naveen, would you like to add something? Sorry.
Yeah. Before Naveen takes up, so one more dimension I would like to have a bit of clarification from your side. Say, there's also a lot of projects where crowdsourcing of information is done. And how do you see that compared to the citizen science? What you're talking
the same thing. It's virtually, I mean, a quick answer is it's used as an alternative. Crowdsourcing is the same as, so a majority of the citizen science projects today are data crowdsourcing projects. There are other categories also, but a majority of them in India and globally are crowdsourcing of data projects. Yeah.
Sure. Just to push that forward. Thanks, Ranu. See, in some ways, we are actually now moving beyond the book, but the implications of what we have done with the book in that sense. So if you look at the crevices of Indian regulatory state, you also see certain stated ambitions of participation, public participation in environmental regulation, environmental monitoring. And you also see certain claims that since the 90s, so it's almost 20 odd years now, right, of a claim that we are going to use the precautionary principle in environmental regulation. So in both these sort of claims, you see the possibility of the public coming together in particular ways for monitoring, or even for creation of particular sets of information which will help regulation in a particular way. So within that context, when you look at, as Pankaj said earlier, the emergence of new technological platforms. So what are the possibilities of citizenship making becomes, I think, very important in terms of two different streams coming together. You see a particular sliver of Indian society more visible, which for us would be a certain kind of, say, a set of wildlife enthusiasts or bird watchers. So they are already hooked up to the Internet of Things in a particular way. They have certain kinds of cameras and so on. So you see certain kind of existing networks to suck up data in a particular way. So in some ways, these citizens become data points, moving data points. And yet, there is also something more invisible. There is an invisible infrastructure, which are the kinds of platforms where this kind of large-scale data associations are made possible. So really the question is, what sort of a citizenship making happens in these platforms? Yeah, so, and are there, what sort of political values are made through in this platform? That becomes something very intriguing for us. And we really don't know what is the methodology through which we can understand it better. I don't know whether I'm making sense to your question.
Okay. Many times in such such studies where mainstream institutions basically crowdsource information from people, when the issues are non-controversial, they are taken easily. But when the issues are controversial, it could be about water bodies, land census, which was done, and many other things. I would say in agriculture, we have seen many things happening around that kind of thing. So could you see any such things when you are actually going through the literature? You presented only 17 cases, but probably you might have come across many more cases which you have not presented here. And yeah, so that's something which I'm keen to understand actually.
So I think it's a little early in that sense where the citizen science thing is concerned, but there are 2 or 3 interesting examples. There is one project, I mean, interestingly, that project itself is that citizen science project itself, I think, is not as active as it used to be. But there was data generated through this kind of crowdsourcing, if I remember right, on tiger deaths on highways in central India, where the data was actually then presented to court. And I think the court, I don't remember the full details, but I do remember speaking to some people during our research where this crowdsourced data did go to the court. So this earlier question of the credibility still remains. That is one. There is a very interesting, more than the activism part of it, about a year ago or around this time, a very interesting, comprehensive book called The State of India's Birds, if I remember the title right, was published by this consortium of these institutions that have actually used the data that citizens have contributed through these platforms like eBird and stuff like that. So it's a very comprehensive and a very interesting and a very contemporary picture of the status of birds in India, which actually is much more granular than has ever been in the past, because data has been sourced from thousands of citizens, millions of data points over many years from across the Indian landscape. So, as knowledge creation, certainly there seems to be a very interesting possibility there, and that's what they're beginning to do. The other, so I think I just kind of refer to a question that, say, Usha has asked, and I was just seeing that in the process of we doing our project. So Usha's question is there on the YouTube channel, which I just saw. This counter science kind of thing, where 1 or 2 of the projects that we spoke to that do identify as citizen science, but these are institutionally located in the NGO kind of, or the social science and the social research kind of frame. And there they use the term of counter science, which is a little bit like what you mentioned, Ramu, of what was happening in the past, where what they are saying is that we want to use citizens, we want to use people who are dependent on the resource and are resident in that space to generate ideas, information, and understanding of a landscape which is otherwise at threat by the state, by the creation of a certain narrative of that landscape by the state. So if the state says, or the institution, the scientific institution of the state says that this is what resources available in this landscape, and we are going to use this land for something else, where is the counter argument or the counter knowledge practice or the counter knowledge information? So they say we want to generate that through the participation of citizens, and we create a knowledge base through rigorous scientific method that challenges that narrative of the state and says that you can't take away this land or can't take away this resource because your story of this landscape and resource is not the complete story. So there it's certainly a political kind of thing, but the method is slightly different, or perhaps might actually fit the community science and people science kind of thing, where people come together and they then go about using certain methods, scientific methods, to gather data about that landscape. So there, this question of the political position kind of seems to become more explicit.
Just to add to that, Pankaj, if you look, I'm right now sitting in the gas chamber that is Delhi. So, and the last 4-5 years, you can really see the difference, the controversies in data of what is a AQI, right? I mean, the government regulatory data would show 200 to 250, 300. And at the same time, there'll be other outside data will be 600, 500. So you already see this kind of, and a lot of times the embassy data within, Delhi is full of embassies will have their own sets of data, which is never made public for politically sensitive reasons. And you also have, so those are in some ways private data, right? Sort of private institutions coming. But there are also remarkably networks of data points made by particular platforms, interested platforms, sometimes called private platforms, sometimes called citizen platforms. And they always challenge this. You also have similar endeavors. I remember in 2018-19, IISc, the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, they were doing mobile data collection of air quality index as well. So you do have examples where there are contestations about what is the level of pollutants in air. Well, I'm not entirely sure how this will play out in the future when this controversies become starker. But there is definitely space for the counter science, so to say. And yet I feel we are talking about scale in a particular way. If we need to challenge particular kinds of data, then the scale has to be really large. And when that scale has to come in, platforms becomes key. What are the platforms through which this large-scale data can be generated? I think that's the challenge to be able to answer your question, Ram, in a more fuller way.
Right. Yeah. Can we, when we, then let's come back to the book itself, and then if you go, because now the people before we answer the questions, etc., probably will be interested to understand more about the book, and then we discuss more about the methodologies and our understanding of how we go about how do we do this. But about the book itself, if you want to say something, both of you.
Naveen, you want to?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a brief book. It's actually a easy read, and it's not much to read also actually. So we must say we got some quite brutal criticism also in terms of reviews, saying you can hardly call this a book and all that. But I think but 2-3 reasons at least for me to put it together finally, because it was an outcome of a project we did at IIT Delhi, Naveen and me. And I felt it had value because it was the first study of its kind. It has serious limitations, but it starts, I think, to create and hopefully create some kind of discussion, debate, and interest. We did get some interesting insights. So the narrative part is very small. But what we did, and that's partly the criticism in the book, is the 17 projects that we mapped. We have provided a lot of information, almost like the second part of the book, which is the annexures for each of these projects, almost as the raw data, which we then have used also to analyze and make the conclusions that we do. And like I said, as an analyst, not so much as a participant. And at least some of the responses that we've been getting, the book has not been out very long, is that a lot of people are also finding those annexures, as it were, as interesting as the main part of the book. So it's almost half and half. And the annexures are actually tables. We kind of tabulated the data, and Ramu, you would have seen it.
I've seen this, yeah.
So, things like who is the coordinator, what is the institution, how many citizen science actually contribute to that data, how many data points have been contributed, what is the nature of that citizen science project? Is it a curriculum-based, education-related project, or is it a data gathering project? What are the species that the projects are targeting? In some cases, there are certain species or taxa. In other cases, like Naveen mentioned, there are platform, internet platforms that are aggregating data. So that raw information itself is very interesting, because I was not expecting that in the response to the book. But I think there are many people who are getting interested in this whole field of citizen science. And this might become an interesting starting point resource to see how others are doing these projects. And I might just add here that over the last 3 years, there has been this India Citizen Science Conference that's been happening. And it's been happening every year for the last 2 years. And this year is going to be on the 26th of November. It's a one-day kind of meet. It's an online thing. I am on the steering committee with actually some of the project coordinators of these citizen science projects. So it's been a fascinating journey. And some of those talks and things are available online. So there's a lot of resource available. There's a citizen science directory that we have on that website, where about 30 projects that again self-identify as citizen science are up there. So what I'm realizing is that the study we did and the projects that are happening are kind of talking to each other, and they're kind of feeding into each other, and we are able to raise some questions. We are able to mobilize the book for more information. People are using the book for more information as well. So the book is 40-45% of a narrative and 50% or so of the data that we kind of generated. And there's some quantitative information, some qualitative information, and there's also one dimension of some policy kind of thing that we do speak about, based again on what the projects are kind of saying. So things like financial sustainability, data ownership, these things are part of the discourse. They have to become part of the discussion if they have not. So we've highlighted some of those.
Naveen.
No, I think Pankaj has really summed it up very well. I could not have done a better job. Thanks.
And since we are at it, Ramu, I mean, since you've seen the book, how would you kind of look at it, and also give us some critical feedback even as we speak?
No, as a format, I found it interesting because the first few chapters, first few chapters where you analyzed it was more interesting for me because the project's data was available. So it's a compilation of data, but more than that, your analysis was really interesting. So that's what I wanted to actually, all my questions were around that, because I actually wanted to see, to understand and then take it forward in my own area of work, because in agriculture, day in, day out, we face the same kind of issues. And in terms of participation of institutions in this is very low. So that's another thing. So the acceptance of institutions for the data which is collected by people is very low in the public institutions, particularly in the area of agriculture and rural development. That's why I was trying to understand what made it interesting, and then for the projects to take off and then projects to involve people in such crowdsourcing kind of thing is what I'm trying to understand. But as a methodology is, I think it's a quite interesting. As a publication itself is quite interesting. Before handing over to Kinara, one question. This is the first steps, as you rightly titled it. Then what is the next steps? How are you looking at it?
COVID.
Beyond this book and as a project?
So I think now, since I've been at IIT in Bombay now for 3-4 years, there's a growing interest in this whole thing in citizen science. There are sometimes I feel a little too much than what the field has to offer. But I think 2-3 things can be done. One is if further understanding of what's going on, and I'm talking here of ecology instance, but to kind of unpack how people are approaching this whole thing. So we have some insights. I think that'd be very interesting. I think going further, and for example, agriculture, air pollution, and stuff like that in the environment field, I think might be very interesting areas to pick up from this. Now, how it can be done, where it can be done, I'm not too sure. And I think both methodologically and otherwise, these might be challenges. It might actually be a modification of the old people science and community science kind of thing, I feel. I mean, but that would need to be worked out. Other more analytical dimensions, for example, would be to understand who this citizen scientist is across projects. What are their motivations? Why do they contribute data? So what is, for example, their demographic? So some work is being done on that. I had a master's student who did a very small project, which is very interesting, on bird watchers in the IITB campus who are contributing to as citizen scientists. So maybe I think he studied 6 or 7 of them, but different brackets of age. And so you start to understand what are people's motivations. Because what's very clear is, for various reasons, this is taking off. I mean, some statistics from the West talk of value in terms of billions of dollars of being generated in terms of knowledge value, thousands of projects, etc., etc. So I think one is to keep looking at it from this distance as the analyst, and the other is for people who are interested to use the methods, because the methods have tremendous promise. But like Naveen also said, spatial and temporal scales and very interesting data sets and analysis can come about. And I think the potential is very huge. So I think it's a very exciting field going ahead. From an anthropological perspective, science perspective, policy perspective, that might be very interesting as well. Yeah.
3 quick addition to what Pankaj is already saying. First is now taking on the point about agriculture. So when we look at, there are 6 or 7 different target areas of CIRSI conference, which Pankaj was mentioning earlier. about there are different trust areas. I think in early 21, the same panel which Pankaj is part of, the National CIRSAI conference. So agriculture is one of them. So there are some, this is really interesting in one way, because this is, in some ways, it's supposed to be a citizen endeavor, but it's state-led. There is a lot of state involved in this initiative. Okay. And they have identified target areas, and agriculture happens to be one of them. I'm not entirely sure what work has been done on that. That's the first sort of a response. The second response is, we need to, again, I think we are asking this question, how is it that in certain arenas, you have a lot of citizen participation and not in others, which is what you are also trying to think about, yes. Right? So to trivialize a little bit, certain kind of bird watching, a certain kind of wildlife attracts a certain kind of population.
Correct.
And that's not the same with, so even in urban air pollution, it can come in willy-nilly in a different way. But in agriculture, there is the temporal and spatial scales are so large. We really need something like that. I agree with you. The challenge then is how do we tap into this in a particular way? We have so many mobile health devices across which can be used. So I think really the task of the decade now is to see in pesticide use, in other kinds of really poison use which we do in agriculture, how do we end up really channeling and really harvesting this? It's like, as the German theorist Shoshana Zuboff talks about the attention economy. Big data has tapped into our attention in particular ways. And it's really the contemporary turn in science as a regulatory scientific turn. So how can we then get into large-scale arenas like agriculture too? I think that's really the challenge, and I hope we can do something. Thank you.
Yes, that's interesting. Probably we'll discuss about it further, and then we can look at it. Yeah, I think the discussion was interesting, and the book itself was interesting, and then discussing with you both really give better understanding on the current context where we are looking at crowdsourcing information involving citizens, and where it's working, and then how probably we should look at it in terms of knowledge making, because it's high time we democratize knowledge making. I think it's high time. Otherwise, it's too much of centralization happened, and then we have already seen the fallouts of these things. So in taking it forward, I think this paves really first steps, so we get good insights into what is happening around, and then probably we can take this forward. Yeah, thank you very much for both the book as well as for today's discussion. Thanks, Kinara, for giving me this opportunity to be part of the discussion.
No, thank you also for coming in spite of a family emergency. I think that was very nice of you to be in time in spite of the pressure that you had. We've had some good questions, and if there's time, probably I'll add one of my own at the end. I think one question that Pankaj had already referred to is Usha's question, but maybe I'll read it out and you can reiterate some things that you want to say to the rest of the audience as well. Usha says, can you speak a little about what in your book you've called counter science? How has that been received or framed by the science establishment? Unmute.
Yeah. So Usha, it is actually one example in the set of 17 that we were studying, and it was on the other end of that spectrum of citizen science projects. This is like I was mentioning during the conversation with Ramu, a specific case where they were trying to, triggered by a certain situation in a particular space where there is a claim to the land and the resource, and how do you fight the claim over a particular use of the land and the resource? So you generate a set of knowledge, and because what comes across from the institutional setup is a scientific or an evidence-based, whatever we call it, logic of appropriating, to use that word, the resource, and how do you stake another claim on that resource, or how do you create another narrative about that resource? So counter science, in a sense, is a counter to the narrative of the state, or a narrative of the more powerful or the hegemonic force, if I might put it that way. And we saw there are one or two examples, at least in the set that we studied, including that example I gave of the Lakshadweep project, where actually they didn't want to call themselves citizen science. So there's another very interesting thing. So we included them just as an exception. They said so the category of the citizen. So this project, the other one that called counter science, wanted them to be called citizen science because they wanted to mobilize the category of the citizen. Otherwise, it is this urban elite, in their opinion, urban elite, people with leisure who are the citizens who contribute to citizen science. But the poor person who actually has to take time out from his or her daily livelihood activity and come and do this citizen science also is a citizen. So it's a very interesting kind of political act, so to say, of wanting to be the citizen. And that's where the counter thing came about, because they were trying to create a narrative of science and the resource, which is different from that of the state. And I'll just also add one thing here in response to what Ramu said. And I think there's a lot of excitement and hope about the democratization of science through citizen science. And I am a little skeptical about whether it will deliver that. I think the agenda should be there, the effort should be there, but I don't think citizen science, in the way it's happening, can deliver that agenda of democratization. It might contribute to it, but we might be overloading our expectations if we rely on citizen science as practiced or understood today for a political push and for democratization. So it may be the best we have at the moment, but I don't think it goes all the full distance. And we see that in the way the projects pan out. And that's not anybody's fault. I'm not pointing fingers, but I think it requires a lot more fundamental something. I don't know how to put it here.
MS Ram has a question. Hi, Pankaj, I have a question related to your point about the differences between citizen science, where the data collectors have a stake in the data being collected, as in fishermen versus bird watchers.
So, am I still mute? No. So, Ram, this is again, just to go back methodologically, we're kind of reporting what the project proponents have themselves said. And in the book, it's kind of, it's a little more articulate. But this fundamental difference between, like I said earlier, of not having a stake in the resource and having a stake in the resource. I mean, at a very simplistic diversions of the engagement with the resource. So that is where that question kind of came up. And I think it's a very interesting articulation. This actually is by Naveen Nambutri from Dakshin Foundation, and where they work with fisherfolk in Lakshadweep. And that's what they have been trying to say, that how do you involve people whose livelihood is dependent on the resource that they are studying? And there are methodological challenges. And how different is it from something where your livelihood is not dependent on the resource that you're studying? So I think it's a very interesting formulation. We'll have to academically, conceptually, theoretically, empirically, further understand and engage with it to make more sense of it. But it was very interesting in the way they put it.
He continues the question and he says that, what is your view on citizen science initiatives like bird data collection when bird watching becomes a competition instead of leisure? Would it be different from the fishing data?
I think it'd be great to ask this question to our friends who are doing these projects. And, I think they have some very interesting insights. And it's always very fascinating to talk to, and Ram would know many of these people, like Suhail Kader, who's with Bird Count India, or any of the other projects. They have their own understanding and own experience with that kind of thing. So, the competitiveness is one way in which citizen participation is being encouraged. So, how many birds did you upload? How many names did you document? So I think those things are happening, and it seems to be working. What's very interesting otherwise also, and something that needs to be understood, is that at least birders are saying that the way that they're doing birding has changed because of the technologies that have come in and the fact that they're contributing to these platforms. So the way they're going about doing their birding is different from an era when they were only doing with binoculars, paper and pen, as against now doing it with an app that you can actually track and upload data as on the move. Now, this anthropologically, I think might be very, very interesting to study what implications it has for the birds and data and for the experience of birding is something that we have to talk to the birders and try and understand. I think a shift is happening. It's quite evident. So when you go out birding, and Ram, I'm sure you also do that. When I'm going out birding with friends here in IIT Bombay, you can see that people are contributing to these portals. There's slight difference in the way that they do their birding as compared to somebody who's just going out with a binocular and a pen and a paper. These might be subtle shifts or might be substantial shifts. And in my new avatar, I'm interested in those processes of how that is happening. But it is happening, and it will be very interesting to see what these changes are, if that answers your question.
Okay. T. Swaminathan asks, is it really possible to keep politics out of science? It is quite easy to see this connection in established institutions, including NGOs. How does the citizen science differ on this?
Can I take this?
Yeah. Yes, Naveen.
Yeah. I mean, politics is like the air that we breathe. We can't keep it out. I think when we talk about science, I feel it's erroneous to think about science as a value-free activity. We are always doing scientific research with some political value at the end. So I don't even think it's desirable to imagine a science without politics.
Well, yes, yeah.
Sheetal asks, we are Sheetal, how are data collectors given credit in the form of publication in citizen science projects? How does this process vary across different citizen science projects that are covered in the book?
So we've actually not looked at it in such detail, Sheetal, but my understanding is that at least the citizen science projects that we have spoken to, the coordinators, I think they're very aware, acutely aware of the importance and the relevance of giving credit where due. So now how it's finally panning out in the authorship and all the of papers and all that, one needs to see. But we are talking here of a very, I would put it that way, because many of them are people I know for a long time, and I've been also interacting for this project. They are trying to figure out ways of ensuring participation, ensuring credit, and things like that. There might be other limitations of some kinds, but how exactly that's happening might be another very interesting area to kind of investigate. Who are the authors? How are they managing authorship, etc., etc. And it might be a good question to ask the project coordinators and scientists who are actually coordinating these projects. But I think a very important question. And generally, I think the citizen science community is quite aware and sensitive to these matters. I mean, that's why they are in citizen science in the first place. One has to make that they do acknowledge the value of people, they do acknowledge the value of different kinds of knowledge systems. They do acknowledge the value of citizen participation. So I think in that sense, they're all on board in that way. To what extent they're able to actually make it happen, I think are challenges both within the structures of the institution and of the methods of doing and publishing and stuff like that. I have also just put in the website of the Citizen Science India conference, and the homepage has the details of the 26th November event. So please do look it up. There is the place, there's also a possibility of actually contributing. There is, if you're doing projects, there are abstracts can be submitted. It's going to be a much shorter version this time. But yeah, please do look it up.
Sorry, this is, I think, the most common problem in Zoom sessions, unmute oneself. Yeah. I have a couple of questions. One is in agriculture, I find that farmers started with a great faith in, initially there was trepidation, but there was a great faith in the science, and which later moved to quick fixes. And now there is a total disregard. So no matter what our data says, but I feel that there's a loss of faith in science amongst some segments of this sector. What do you say?
I think Ramu's best placed to answer this.
I was going to say the same thing.
I already mentioned. See, we are in a situation where, see, when we talk about science, whose science basically? What do you actually mean by science? Today, I see the institutionalized science, particularly in agriculture, is a very outdated one. They're not updating themselves based on what they are able to observe, and then they're unable to do that. And when science becomes a job, you lose methodology. You actually lose the methodology, and you stick to what you studied or probably what your teacher studied. I would say that's what is happening. And in agriculture today, the whole fight is whether the 70 years old knowledge is right or 1,000 years old knowledge is right. We are not looking at
is it
nothing
knowledge
about
or faith?
today.
You know, I have
Nothing
knowledge,
about
I
today.
have no issues, but
Yeah,
faith,
I would
yes,
say,
do
yeah,
have a lot of
yeah.
issues.
Yeah, I would say I call it faith, they call it knowledge. That's okay. But nothing about today's problem or tomorrow's problem, and how do we resolve that? Very unfortunately. So I think that's where we are trying to look at how these new knowledge systems, generating knowledge or utilizing knowledge, innovations. Every sector, if you see, I think it's user-generated innovations made the difference.
Yes,
User-generated
exactly.
innovations,
Exactly.
certainly. And every sector, historically, if you see, science evolves. It's not that it won't get stuck, say, 70 years back or 100 years back or 1,000 years back kind of thing. Unfortunately, we get stuck. And the whole system which is fighting for rationality is very irrational. So if you look at the whole science, agricultural science kind of thing. So there, I see it will rapidly change, and it is rapidly changing as well. Say, if you look at last 10 years, key decisions, major decisions in agriculture are not made by the institutions, are not based on the institutional knowledge, whether we talk about natural farming, whether we talk about ban on BT cotton and BT brinjal, ban on BT brinjal or herbicide tolerant cottons, or today the decision about GM mustard, neither decision to permit nor decision to stop, not based on institutional science. So they're basically losing and becoming more irrelevant by not actually making people as partners. I would say that's what I was trying to understand. Say, if ornithologists could make bird watchers as part of their science knowledge generation, why does agriculture scientists don't make farmers as part of their
Exactly.
Knowledge generation? Right? So that's, and I came across, in fact, some of the interesting studies happening, and then some interesting citizens, I would say, on weather side. I really came across some very interesting things happening where people who are not into the mainstream institutions but doing a lot of good work on weather observations and also giving knowledge about it. Wonderful work has been done. Similarly, on innovations in agriculture, farm machinery, in several areas where mainstream institutions failed, actually citizens are doing really well. So I would say that's what I would say. Similarly, on monitoring, say on the farmer suicide issues or on varieties, for example, reviving traditional varieties or actually improvising and releasing new varieties. A lot of work has been done in India now, even in agriculture also. I would say probably it's a long way to go, but today we have reached a stage where we could challenge the establishment and then take it forward. But actually, partnerships is something which is important. It's not about overthrowing them, right? It's actually working together so that we can build a better system. So it's not about one versus other, but how do we evolve together is something which is important from agriculture point of view, is what I would say.
No, I would agree, because even in the health sector, we have seen a lot of top-down prescription-oriented kind of data gathering, etc. And I was actually humbled at the field, where one Anganwadi worker used her creativity and knowledge in position the same thing to different groups of people differently, like lactating mothers and farm, laborers, very differently, the same particular product. Yes. And she was not even asked to do that. She did it out of her own volition, of her own thinking. And unfortunately, I don't think we are documenting any of these.
Correct.
And that is the saddest part of citizen science, in ecology or any other sector in India, that the knowledge that is so vast, it is first is not participatory, and it's more prescriptive in terms of data collection. And secondly, the knowledge is not captured. I was really humbled by this lady, and who taught me things which I could not find in any textbook or any other place. So yes, I think we have still a long way to go, but there are a lot of committed people. 3 are here already, and I hope that there are a lot more people in the field who will be doing this, and we can make it much more participatory and knowledge sharing, and we build a better society for our future generations. I would like to thank Pankaj and Naveen for this very interesting book and the interesting discussion, and Ramu for making it so very interactive and engaging. And once again, thank you, Ramu, for joining in spite of a family emergency. Now, before we sign off, I'd like to remind our viewers again, our next monthly Friday session is on December 2nd, and it's on the Slightly Foxed podcast. The title itself is so interesting. Gail Perkis and Hazel Wood will be in conversation with Usha Raman, our team member. So please do watch it. I'm sure it will be very interesting. Even those who don't listen to podcasts, maybe after this, you will get into listening to podcasts. Now, with this, I thank all our viewers and our distinguished guests on this panel today for a very lively and engaging session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kinara. Thank you, Raju. Ramu.
Thank you.